In April 1945, in central Germany, the forests of Thuringia were still gripped tight by morning fog. The air carried that particular smell of war at its very end, the rusty tang of steel, the bitter sting of explosives, and the cloying sweetness of rotten roots beneath the soil. Private Erich Werner lay curled against the damp lip of a foxhole, his ear pressed to a crackling field radio, whose signal kept thinning to static. His company commander, an older lieutenant who had come back alive from Stalingrad with a burn scar that climbed over half his face, had just crouch-walked through the position and delivered what might be the last order their battered company would ever receive. "Orders from headquarters," the lieutenant said, his voice dry. "Move southeast to the vicinity of Arnstadt and link up with units of the 9th Army. Build a line. Buy time for Berlin." He finished, let his eyes pass over the young faces beside him, filthy and numb, and said nothing more. Everyone knew what "buy time for Berlin" meant. On the radio, their own broken instructions were mixed with other traffic. To the west, a clear English channel with an American accent was calling fire coordinates, so close it was frightening. To the east, beyond the horizon, what rolled in was not light but a low, continuous thunder, as though the earth itself were groaning through indigestion. Soviet heavy artillery firing in salvos. They could feel the tremor in the mud beneath their boots. Next to Erich, Hans, even younger than he was, hugged a rifle that was nearly empty. His teeth chattered without his permission. "Southeast, Arnstadt," Hans repeated, staring with pure fear. "That is straight into the Russians' encirclement, is it not?" Erich did not answer. With his index finger he drew two short lines in the cold dirt beaded with dew. One pointed west, straighter. One pointed east, slightly trembling. When he finished, he stared at the two marks as if they were some profound rune. Then he looked up toward where the lieutenant had disappeared, and then back at Hans. There was no fervor in his eyes, no obedience, no rebellion, only exhaustion taken to an extreme, and a calculation in progress, cold and exact. It was not a calculation about honor, duty, or tactical deployment. By the spring of 1945, it had seeped through countless German soldiers as an unspoken arithmetic of survival. It whispered in the beds of retreating trucks, passed hand to hand in the dark of trenches, traveled in glances when the last ration was divided. Simple, brutal, aimed at the core. If the end is going to be laying down your weapon, then make sure you land in American or British hands. To the east, your chances of living are thin. From somewhere came the grinding clatter of tracks over broken stone. Gunfire began to pop in singles, then closer, tightening like a noose. Erich knew that he and the faces around him, young and old alike, were standing at a fork more abstract than the battlefield itself. Left or right. The choice had almost nothing left to do with courage or loyalty. It had been thinned to the most basic instinct of a living creature: to keep living. Did you want to see the first dawn after the war ended? Many German veterans who survived that era would speak decades later, in interviews and memoirs, of a fear more concrete than death. What they feared, sometimes, was not the bullets themselves, but what came after. The moment when your last cartridge is gone, you raise both hands and step out from behind cover. You do not know whose face you will meet, or what expression it will wear. You do not know whether what comes next is a cup of water or a bullet. The cruel humor of history is that this gulf of fate, depending on whom you surrendered to, was not merely the accident of a given hour on a given day. Its groundwork had been laid long before, buried deep from the moment the war erupted in two utterly different forms. It came from systems, from ideas, from two completely different logics of war. Let us step away from Erich and the suffocating choice before him and lift our gaze to the statistical height of history. When the smoke finally cleared, when historians began, like people sorting a shattered puzzle, to sift through the mountain of casualty reports, prisoner lists, and missing person files, a set of comparative numbers emerged whose disparity could chill the spine. On the Western Front, within the POW camp systems of the British and Americans, the fate of captured German soldiers was, in broad terms, predictable. The precise figures varied with campaigns, years, and conditions, but across multiple national archives and historical research, one basic consensus holds. Of German soldiers captured by Britain and the United States, more than 95% lived to see the day they were released. They endured confinement of varying length, There might be malnutrition, disease, long homesickness, the depression of defeat. But in the vast majority of cases, their lives were preserved. Mortality was usually kept to single-digit percentages and often lower. Now, force your eyes east to that wide and brutal front stretching from the plains of Poland to the ruins of Stalingrad and on toward the Caucasus foothills. Here the numbers take on an entirely different darkened tone. Based on Soviet declassified materials, German tracking data and fragmented records, historians have traced a shuddering range. In Soviet hands, the death rate among German POWs is estimated to have fluctuated between 35% and 60%. What does that mean? It means that, on average, for every 3 German servicemen who went east into the POW camps, at least 1 never came back. In some extreme cases, the initial death rate may have reached 65% or more. Cold, hunger, wounds, disease, and harsh treatment combined into an efficient machine of death. These are not abstract games with numbers. Put the figures back into human bodies. Over the course of the Second World War, the total number of German and Axis auxiliary soldiers captured by the Western Allies stood at roughly 3.5 to 4 million. The number captured by the Soviet Union exceeded 3 million as well. Even if we take the most conservative estimates, 5% mortality in the West and 35% in the East, the gap in percentages still translates into hundreds of thousands of living people who did or did not return. This is not a matter of tactical victory. It is a sieve of fate, its mesh size changing with direction. Cold statistics may lack the warmth of tears, but they anchor the word luck to something measurable, comparable, and bloody. For an ordinary German soldier after 1944, surrender as an action did not by itself decide life or death. But the direction of surrender was almost the same as rolling a survival die. To the west, the face marked live came up more than 19 times out of 20. To the east, the face marked die rose abruptly to at least 1 in 3. And yet, can we simply explain the gulf as a matter of national character? Americans as more merciful? Soviets as more brutal? History refuses such cheap, black-and-white answers. The difference in outcomes was, at bottom, a difference in systems. 2 machines built and run under entirely different political ideas, practical constraints and philosophies of war, producing results that reflected those inputs. To understand what lay behind 95%, we have to walk closer to the Western machine and watch how it worked. Imagine you're a German soldier on the Western Front. The fighting ends. You lift your hands. Typically, the first person to reach you is not a crazed gunman, but a stern procedural American MP or British military policeman. He orders you to drop all weapons, searches you quickly but thoroughly, and takes anything that might be dangerous or of intelligence value. Then you are guided, with other prisoners, toward a temporary collection point. There may be canvas tables with a clerk officer behind them, recording basic information, name, rank, unit. The process might be noisy and chaotic, dust in the air, but its purpose is clear: registration and control. You are converted from an enemy soldier into a managed POW unit. Next comes transport. Trucks, trains, or ships carry you to more permanent camps farther back. Some are in the British countryside, some in old barracks in France, and for a significant number, across the Atlantic to the vast interior of the United States, to camps built for the purpose. Wherever the destination, the process is wrapped as far as possible in a framework modeled on the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War. Inside the main camps, the procedures become more detailed. You are assigned an individual prisoner number that will follow you through the years of confinement. There is usually a medical inspection. Those who are sick are isolated to contain outbreaks. Your information is recorded more carefully, and through the International Committee of the Red Cross, efforts are made to notify your family. That notification matters. It pulls you back from the terror of missing, fate unknown, and places you on a track of confirmed alive, location known. For families at home, it is often a consolation beyond measure. Daily life inside the camp is highly regulated and monotonous. Strict schedules, roll calls, work assignments. Barracks may be wooden or brick, crowded but capable of keeping out wind and rain. Rations are issued by the captor. They are not generous. Hunger is common, especially late in the war when supplies across Europe are tight. But the calorie level is usually designed above the minimum needed to keep an adult male alive without heavy labor. Preventing mass non-combat deaths aligns with the administrator's interests. In addition, Red Cross relief parcels are a rare bright spot. Canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, cigarettes, soap, sometimes books or playing cards. They are nourishment and goods. but also a psychological sign that the thread to the outside world has not been entirely cut. Labor becomes an important part of the camp economy and its management. With large numbers of young men deployed to the front, agriculture, construction and logistics in Britain and America faced acute labor shortages. Healthy prisoners were organized for clearly defined non-military work: harvesting crops, picking fruit, cutting timber, loading and unloading along rail lines, repairing roads. In the United States, some prisoners participated in waterworks and camp construction. Under the Geneva framework, such labor was permitted, and officers could be exempted. Enlisted prisoners who worked were, at least in principle, given a token wage, often in a form usable only inside the camp canteen, enough to buy a little extra tobacco or soap. Many prisoners who lived through this period and were eventually released did not describe it as paradise. There was boredom, bitterness, the sting of homesickness, humiliation as the defeated, anxiety about the future. Yet they often used one word for the experience: predictable. You knew roughly where the boundaries were. You knew what the day would bring. You knew that if you did not seriously violate the rules, your basic physical safety and your access to enough food to keep you alive were likely to be protected. In the madness of World War, it was an accidental kind of stable hardship, a captivity that ran by rules. For men who had survived the front, it created a huge, ironic psychological contrast. The core of the system was less a matter of noble kindness than a hard, institutional management philosophy. Prisoners were disarmed military personnel, partially protected by international norms, who could be registered, classified, housed, and used as labor in an orderly way. Managing them required efficiency and order, not extra hatred and slaughter. But thousands of kilometers to the east, inside a very different war machine, the very concepts of order, rules, and predictability were thrown out from the first day. Before we enter the darkness of the Eastern Front, pause and feel the contrast. Imagine two parallel scenes, both taking place in May 1945, right after the war ends. Scene A. On the Western Front, in a POW camp converted from an old airfield, German prisoners line up in the morning mist under guard to receive breakfast. Perhaps oatmeal, a slice of bread, a bit of margarine. Not much, but the line moves. At the edge of the camp, Red Cross staff check a list of incoming relief supplies with American administrators. A few prisoners sit on the steps of a barracks, carving small objects from scraps or trying to mend clothing. The atmosphere is oppressive, but calm. They know the war is over. The question is, when do we go home? Scene B. Somewhere on the Eastern Front, at the edge of a forest, an open area enclosed only by crude posts and barbed wire is packed with gaunt figures. They wear torn uniforms. Many have no shoes, feet wrapped in rags. There are no proper barracks, only a few leaking shelters. Morning brings no fixed ration. A Soviet truck may arrive and toss out sacks of dark bread or frozen potatoes. The crowd surges like water, then breaks apart under shouting and shoving, leaving the weakest on the ground. There are no Red Cross markings, no medical tents, only armed sentries and crows circling overhead. They also know the war is over, but home is as distant as a story from another planet. The question is whether there will be something to swallow today, and whether there will be a windbreak tonight before the cold kills them. These scenes are not inventions. They come from fragmented descriptions by survivors. They show, in a direct way, the gulf between institutional management and bare survival. The Western story is survival within rules. The Eastern story, from the beginning, is the absence of rules, the reduction of human beings to the most primitive condition inside systemic collapse and ideological hostility. What forces shaped a road so different and so lethal in the East? Not a single cause, but a stack of fatal factors, a perfect storm. To understand death rates that climbed as high as 30 to 60%, we have to return to dawn on June 22, 1941, when destiny was set. When German tanks crossed the border and launched Operation Barbarossa, both leaderships framed the war with an unprecedented color of ideological extermination. In Nazi propaganda, it was a holy war against the nest of Jewish Bolshevism. Slavs were treated as inferior. Political commissars were to be shot on the spot. Stalin and the Soviet propaganda machine, for their part, defined it as the Great Patriotic War, a struggle to the death against fascist beasts. Every German soldier was an invader, a criminal. This absolute hatred designed at the top was injected like poison into armies and populations. When a German soldier on the Eastern Front laid down his weapon, what he met first was often not a military procedure, but the thick filter of that ideology. He was a fascist pest, one of the guilty agents of immense suffering. For many Soviet soldiers, especially after seeing atrocities in occupied territories, the idea of humane treatment for such prisoners was emotionally and morally difficult to accept. And in the early war, Stalin explicitly rejected applying reciprocal standards for POW treatment. At the level of institutions, restraints were removed. Yet, more widespread and more lethal than direct violence was a systematic collapse of material capacity. In the first months of war, the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Millions were captured or killed. Vast Western territories fell. The Soviet military logistics system, already strained, was ripped apart. Food, medicine, fuel, clothing, everything was scarce. In such a situation, the priority of supplying POWs fell to the bottom. Official ration standards, even when they existed, were astonishingly low and often could not sustain life. What actually reached prisoners was frequently less still, docked or diverted at every level. Hunger became the most constant, most terrifying companion of Eastern captivity. Capture was often only the start. Many prisoners first endured what came to be called death marches. With few transport assets, they were driven in groups on foot to temporary holding areas or rail hubs hundreds of kilometers away through winter cold or spring mud. There was not enough food, not enough warm clothing. Many were captured in summer uniforms. Their footwear was ruined. Along the road, those who fell behind might be shot as burdens or simply left by the side of the path. Disease spread like wildfire through crowded, filthy, weakened bodies. Even if a man survived to reach a camp, it might be nothing more than a stretch of wilderness, surrounded by wire, an abandoned quarry, or roofless factory shells. Survival then entered its core trial. Crowding was beyond imagination. Personal space could shrink to less than a square meter. There was little shelter. Men packed together like sardines for warmth. Sanitation was barely a concept. Latrines were pits in the ground. Waste overflowed and became a breeding ground for epidemics. Medical help was nearly mythical. A handful of medics faced thousands of patients with almost no supplies. Infection, pneumonia, scurvy, and the cascade of complications from severe malnutrition quietly took large numbers of lives every day. A former German soldier named Heinrich G., captured at Stalingrad, endured years of captivity and was repatriated in the early 1950s. In fragments of his diary, he wrote, "In the West, you fight boredom and homesickness. Here in the East, you fight existence itself. Every day you wrestle hunger, cold, and disease with your bare hands. You cannot see tomorrow, and you do not dare imagine next week. Your whole mind contracts to a single point. Today, now, how to find a piece of crust you can still chew, how to squeeze into a spot a little less exposed to the wind without freezing stiff. This is not a place that is managed. This is a place where we vanish on our own, like forgotten livestock." The high death rate was the product of that perfect storm. Ideological hostility dissolving human restraints, the Soviet Union's early logistical collapse leaving it unable to sustain mass captivity, the harsh natural environment, and a general exhaustion of resources. Here, prisoners were not assets to be managed, but an unwanted burden, a group most easily sacrificed when scarcity became absolute. Once you understand that, you understand why the rumor about surrendering West carried such deadly persuasive power. When survival becomes a pure game of probability, any strategy that improves the odds becomes the hardest currency on the battlefield. As the war moved into 1944, the Allied squeeze from East and West tightened. Front lines twisted and closed on the map. For more and more German units and individual soldiers, military victory had long since become a mirage. But a new, bitter tactical objective grew painfully clear. Do everything possible to make sure you or your unit end up in Western Allied hands. On battlefields, scenes appeared that later would seem full of paradox, even absurd. On the Western Front, some German units that received orders to withdraw eastward and defend the Reich's interior displayed astonishing slowness. Marches dragged. Maps were lost. Contact with higher command was accidentally broken until American scouts or tanks came into view, and then, with a kind of unspoken agreement, weapons were laid down in order. On the Eastern Front, when fast Soviet breakthroughs split formations, the choice of breakout direction took on a symbolic weight. Units stopped trying to rejoin German main forces, which often meant deeper east. Instead, they struggled to slip through any gap and flow west. The final goal was often not to keep fighting, but to find Americans or British and surrender. In extreme cases, small groups and junior officers broke entirely from the chain of command. They swapped uniforms for civilian clothing, relied on familiarity with terrain and a little luck, and trekked across a Germany sliding into chaos. Their mission had only one objective: reach the Allied-controlled zone west of the Rhine, then step out and raise their hands. Geography became a matter of life and death. To surrender west was to step into the predictable system, constrained by rules even when the rules were cold, with a very high chance of survival and a future possibility of reunion. To surrender east was to fall into a black hole of scarcity, uncertainty, and extreme risk, perhaps years of labor and isolation. High commanders might call this shameful defeatism. For frontline soldiers and junior officers, it was a survival strategy based on instinct and rumor. Information did not travel by official bulletin. It traveled by word of mouth, by frontline stories. Did you hear? The X Division surrendered to the Americans near Aachen. They were taken away by truck. They say there was food. Do not let them send you to the far side of the Vistula. My brother's company surrendered. 150 men. Of those, fewer than 20 came back. The rest are buried in Siberia. Eventually the guns fell silent. White flags appeared. Hands went up. But for the men who endured the risk and finally ran in the right direction, crossing inside Western barbed wire, was that wire truly the finish line of their lives? Perhaps, for a small fraction, that cold boundary of defeat and captivity became, through the strange collisions of history, a rough threshold to an unexpected future. On May 8, 1945, the fighting in Europe ended. But for the millions of Germans held in POW camps across the West, the road home remained long and uncertain. For most, the story followed a foreseeable path. They were released in batches, in stages. The process might take months or years. Some officers and men judged to require deeper screening remained longer. They traveled in crowded trains and rocking ships back to a homeland that was familiar and yet alien. They returned to cities reduced to rubble, to families scattered or dead, to strict ration cards, to reconstruction work done by picking usable material from ruin. Their captivity became a heavy, complicated chapter buried deep in memory. They became workers, farmers, clerks again, carrying the collective scar of defeat and their personal losses, rebuilding life and family on German soil. It was a hard road, but it was the common road. Yet there was another path, narrower, more accidental, and still real. For a very small number of prisoners, the years of confinement planted unexpected seeds. Some men in American camps, working on farms, learned basic English and practical skills in machinery or livestock. Day after day, they built connections with local owners or foremen based on work, sometimes even personal respect. In Britain, some prisoners, because of discipline or special skills, were selected for urgent post-war projects, clearing rubble or repairing infrastructure, still under supervision. After the war, Europe lay shattered and desperate for rebuilding. But across the ocean, places like the United States, Canada, and Australia, pushed by wartime economic momentum and post-war growth, faced serious labor shortages, especially in agriculture, construction, and basic industry. Resettlement programs and labor import projects began to operate quietly. The bar was high, screening was strict, sponsors were needed, background checks had to exclude the fanatical. But a narrow channel existed, and so we can glimpse life scripts like these. Karl H., a former Wehrmacht corporal, served in a Bavarian infantry division. He was captured by Americans in late 1944 in Lorraine, then transported to a POW camp in Arkansas and assigned to labor on a cotton plantation. He learned quickly, worked hard, and earned the trust of the owner, old Mr. Johnson. In 1948, with Johnson's formal sponsorship and financial support, Karl secured an immigrant visa. He returned briefly to his ruined hometown, picked up his fiancée Anna, who had waited for him, and the two went back to Arkansas. Karl started as a tenant farmer. 10 years later, he owned a small plot of land and was regarded as a respectable fruit grower. His son later attended a state university. Fritz W., a former Luftwaffe ground crew sergeant, was captured by the British in the Netherlands and held in a POW camp in Yorkshire. Before the war, he had learned some carpentry. In camp, he was assigned to help repair the wooden structure of a rural church damaged by bombing. His fine workmanship left a strong impression on the British engineering officer in charge. In 1950, with a Christian charity's sponsorship and a letter of recommendation from that officer, Fritz emigrated to Ontario as a needed skilled worker. He first worked in a furniture factory, then used his savings to open a small custom cabinet shop, gradually building a stable business. Helmut B., a former Army Staff second lieutenant from an intellectual family, was captured after the Ardennes fighting and held in Britain. Using limited resources from relief organizations and the camp library, he kept the habit of reading and study, even teaching himself English literature. After being repatriated in 1947, he completed an economics degree at the University of Hamburg with remarkable speed. In 1953, he saw an advertisement for a research assistant position at the University of Wisconsin. With strong academic credentials and fluent English, he was hired. He emigrated with his wife, began as an assistant, and eventually became a professor in the business school, specializing in Europe's post-war economic reconstruction. Their trajectories split cleanly from the paths of comrades who returned to Germany to sweat in the deep shafts of Ruhr coal mines, or haul bricks through mountains of rubble in Frankfurt and Cologne. The POW camp, a marker that should have signaled the bottom of life and the end of the road, became for a handful of lucky men a shaky, narrow bridge connecting a destroyed past to a new future, through a sequence of improbable coincidences, specific personal conditions, and a rare historical window. Survive, and then go on living. That was the one common point. But when we place the two post-war paths side by side, one struggling under the physical and psychological ruins of the homeland, one starting over amid opportunity and challenge in a foreign country, a complex question presses down with weight. For the latter, can we easily and without burden call it luck? Or was it simply the massive, insane machine called war, scattering outcomes without fairness or logic, producing a purely random result? Luck. When we lay that word on these former prisoners who emigrated, it becomes both heavy and strangely light, tense with contradiction. Heavy, because this luck stands on multiple layers of brutal comparison. First, against the 1/3 to 1/2 death probability of Eastern Front captivity, to live at all was an astonishing gift of fate. Second, against the countless Western captured men who did return to Germany and still had to struggle through widespread poverty, scarcity, and spiritual disorientation to gain, beyond survival, a stable starting point with prospects and even comfort looks like double, even triple luck. The weight of that luck comes from the mass of misfortune it rises above. And yet it feels light, even unsettling, because the mechanism that distributed it had no moral or rational measure. It did not depend on being kinder, braver, or wiser. It might depend on something like this: whether the officer commanding your unit in April 1945 was more inclined to obey or to be pragmatic, whether the truck you rode in broke down at a fork with its nose pointed west rather than east, whether the MP who processed you happened to be the kind who followed procedure rather than the kind bent on revenge, whether you happened to be assigned to a camp with farm labor instead of a purely holding camp, whether, on that farm, you happened to meet an owner willing to sponsor you rather than a foreman who saw you as a tool. It was a crystallization of coincidence, formed by countless tiny variables colliding in history's current, almost impossible to reproduce. Many such lucky men in old age, looking back over their lives, showed a deep, unresolved complexity. They were sincerely grateful to have lived, grateful for acceptance and opportunity and peace in a new home. They worked hard to become good citizens, good fathers, good neighbors, returning the gift through their actions. And yet a heavy survivor's guilt, like a ghost, hovered in the quietest corner of the heart. Why me? Why did our unit choose surrender while the next camp over fought to the last man? Why can I sit on a porch in Texas and watch the sun go down while my best friend's bones lie in unnamed frozen soil outside Stalingrad? Why can I provide my children and grandchildren with abundance while my cousin in Germany never fully stepped out of the war's shadow? There is no answer to that guilt, and no answer is required. It is part of the survivor's fate, the invisible weight behind that luck. War is not a fair arena. It is a vast, precise, and brutal machine of structural injustice. It takes geopolitical conflict, ideological poison, and the struggle for resources and transforms them into the most direct and violent pressure on individual lives. The luckiest group of prisoners, seen this way, were simply those not swallowed entirely by the deepest darkness while the machine turned. Their story is less an ode to luck than a long, complicated, silent testimony to the absurdity of war, the caprice of fate, and the toughness of human beings in extremity. In 1983, in a small town in central Texas, an elderly man named Carl, the fruit grower mentioned earlier, was invited to speak in a local middle school history class. The classroom was quiet. The students looked at the kindly grandfather with a German accent. He spoke simply, avoiding bloody details, talking more about farm labor in the POW camp, about Mr. Johnson, about how he came to America. At the end, a student asked, "Grandpa Carl, do you think you were lucky?" The old man was silent for a long time. His gaze seemed to pass through the classroom walls toward something far away. At last he said slowly, "Child, I often think of a damp morning in Lorraine, in the autumn of 1944. Our platoon leader, a young man named Hans, only 2 years older than me, received orders from company to withdraw southeast into the woods, but he looked at the map, looked at us, and then said, 'The order is southeast, but I think we can find a better way.' And he led us, in truth, southwest. Because that young man made a wrong decision that damp morning, or a right one, we walked for 3 hours and ran into an American patrol. We put down our weapons. Because we marched in the wrong direction, I lived. I met Mr. Johnson. I came here. I had a family. I had this orchard. I met you curious young friends. I am grateful for all of it. Every day I am grateful. But I can never answer the question of why it was our Hans and not another platoon leader who made that decision. Why it was we who met that patrol and not another unit. I do not know. No one knows. Lucky?" He paused, his voice very light. "Yes, I think I was lucky. But I have always felt that this luck does not belong to me alone. It is too heavy. It belongs to all those who never had the chance to stand here and speak." He stopped. Sunlight came through the windows. Dust drifted slowly in the beams. Peace was so concrete and so fragile. That history of survival, choice, systems, and extreme contingency sank gradually into the deep sea of archives, merged into private memory, and finally returned to silence. Yet it left a lasting echo. In a storm that human beings themselves unleashed, vast enough to swallow everything, an individual fate can be as light as a feather in the wind. Where it drifts, whether it lands safely, is often determined by currents and gusts completely beyond its control. And every survivor who does land spends a lifetime silently bearing what that feather cannot bear, its unbearable lightness and its unbearable weight.